Hello and welcome to my presentation. Today I'll be telling you about my thesis titled NeuroAesthetic Resonance. I'll talk about the background of the project, show you the results of my design process, and explain how I got there. So without further ado, let's get started. The human brain is the foundation of our experience. Our sensory and emotional perceptions of the world around us are all based in neural activity. But does physical brain activity correspond with subjective experience? And is it possible to optimize for both? During my thesis, I've sought to answer this question by framing brain response and aesthetic experience as forms of resonance. Resonance is a term with diverse meanings. Typically, you'll hear it in conversation when someone is describing something, a song, a book, or a person, for example, that they feel deeply connected to. When someone says, "This resonates with me," they're putting words to an intangible relationship between themselves and this something that is meaningful, emotional, and enjoyable for them. It's a feeling of understanding and being understood at the same time. And most importantly, it's hugely personal. What resonates with us depends on our values, our lived experiences, and our culture. So resonance as a term is clearly embedded in culture. But the concept of resonance actually originates in physics. It's used to describe a phenomenon where an oscillatory system, so a system made of waves, is subject to a frequency that is either the same as or very close to a natural frequency of that system. And this increases the amplitude of the system's oscillations, or waves, as a result. We call this external frequency that is applied to the system a resonant frequency. This might sound quite abstract, but there are many examples of resonance in the world around us. For example, let's imagine a glass. If you tap the glass with something, the impact of that tap causes the glass to vibrate, and it makes a sound. This sound has the same pitch no matter what you use to tap the glass, and that's because the glass is vibrating at its natural frequency. Now imagine you put a speaker next to the glass and play that exact same frequency at maximum volume. Because the speaker frequency is the same as the natural frequency of the glass, it resonates. When played, it increases the amplitude of the vibrations in the glass to the point that the glass shatters. This is where the idea of an opera singer shattering a wine glass with their voice comes from. So, resonance can happen with any type of wave. Now, most of us will have heard the term brainwaves before. And although they might sound metaphorical, our brains do actually produce waves. Brainwaves, also known as neural oscillations, happen when a group of neurons produce synchronized electrical impulses at regular intervals. Because the brain is then a system of waves, it can also produce resonance if the right frequency, a resonant frequency, is applied. This is normally done using something called a periodic stimulus, which is a sensory input delivered at a specific frequency. So, for example, a flashing light or a droning sound. According to neuroscientists, resonance in the brain, also known as neural resonance, may have an important role in sensory processing and perception. Inducing neural resonance has been investigated as a potential treatment for a variety of conditions, including Alzheimer's and fibromyalgia, with promising results. It's also the basis of brain-computer interfaces, or BCIs, which measure neural resonance to detect attention, such as looking at a flashing letter on a screen, and translate this to actions, such as spelling a word. However, in clinical applications and in BCIs, literature shows that the periodic stimuli that drive these systems cause both physical and mental fatigue. Because they're one-dimensional and repetitive, they don't usually enhance user experience and can even detract from it. Perhaps a more design-centric way of looking at resonance can help to address this problem. Now, I just mentioned that neural resonance has been found to play a role in sensory processing, and can also be induced through our senses. The senses are a huge part of design and aesthetics, being our first point of contact with the environment, but the way we consider them in design, or at least most of the time, is more metaphorical than scientific. This is also true for the concept of resonance, which design researchers have used to describe subjective experiences, and more specifically aesthetic experiences. In design literature, the term aesthetic resonance is a model of enjoyable and meaningful aesthetic experiences. Here, the aesthetic properties of an artifact or environment are tuned to the senses, and vice versa, creating a deep connection between a person and a design. So, both neural and aesthetic resonance are to do with our senses. The way we understand them is very different, one being physical and the other metaphorical, but both of them occur in response to sensory inputs. However, compared to the body of literature on both of these topics, there's very little exploring the possible relationship between the two. In this space, I saw an opportunity not only to carry out fundamental design research, but to potentially enrich our understanding of aesthetics as designers, and the way we design as a result. My thesis is therefore based around three main research questions about the relationship between neural and aesthetic resonance. 1. Can neural and aesthetic resonance be evoked by the same sensory stimuli? 2. Does peak neural resonance correspond with peak aesthetic resonance? And 3. How can both forms of resonance be embodied in an experiential design? Through my exploration of these three questions, I arrived at a final design concept: a platform for measuring and creating neural and aesthetic resonance through a data-driven, immersive audiovisual experience. Before we get into the details of how I made it and why, let's take a look at the design in action. So now we've seen the final design in action, how does it work? As I mentioned before, this design concept is heavily driven by data. So let's start by briefly taking a look at where this data comes from and how it's interpreted by my platform to influence an experiential design. This diagram shows how the system behind my platform is structured. As we saw in the video, the experience design consists of a visualization and a soundscape. The platform itself consists of a real-time data display and audio-visual controls. The data display analyzes raw data from a participant behind the scenes. It uses the results of this analysis to show information about the degree of neural and aesthetic resonance a participant is currently experiencing, which is then interpreted by a designer. The designer uses interactive controls to adjust the frequency and aesthetic properties of the audio-visual components, so the soundscape and visualization, which together affect the participant's brainwave data, known as EEG, and their aesthetic response. The cycle continues as the designer and participant iteratively optimize the experience together. Overall, this creates a feedback loop between the designer and participant that is mediated by the resonance platform. So, the platform takes in raw data from the participant and analyzes it to work out how much neural and aesthetic resonance is occurring. It does this using what I refer to as resonance metrics, measures of resonance that I've developed to be reliable and simple for designers to interpret in real time. Let's now take a look at how these metrics work, starting with my neural resonance metric. The way my platform measures neural resonance is derived from the work of neuroscientist Christoph Herrmann. This graph shows the results of his study on neural resonance, plotting neural response frequency against stimulus frequency. In the graph, we can see some dark patches with lines drawn through them. The dark patches show neural resonance, and from this we can also see that resonance occurs at many different frequencies in the brain. The line bisecting the plot diagonally shows neural resonance at the same frequency as the stimulus, which Herrmann calls the fundamental frequency. The next one down from it is labelled first harmonic, and shows resonance at double the stimulus frequency. We can see from the graph that these two types of resonance response are the strongest, so together they're a good indication of neural resonance. I chose to use these two responses, the fundamental and the first harmonic, as my measure of neural resonance. So, a brain response at these two frequencies, the fundamental and the first harmonic, together make up my measure of neural resonance. But getting this information isn't straightforward. EEG signals are complex and often difficult to interpret. Luckily, there's software available to help me do just that. I pre-process and analyse EEG in a program called NeuroPipe, which is shown in this image. NeuroPipe is specialised software for analysing EEG data, and I use it to clean up the signal, then apply spectral analysis. This means that I'm unravelling the raw signal and seeing how much power there is at each frequency in a given range. A spectral analysis plot looks like this. Here we can see something called power spectral density, or PSD, being plotted against each frequency in a given range. This is effectively telling me how much of each frequency is present in a person's brain data, which means I can then look specifically at the fundamental and first harmonic frequencies, depending on the stimulus frequency, to see if neural resonance is occurring. But this information on its own doesn't give the full picture of what's happening. If I notice a sudden increase in, say, 10 Hz activity in someone's EEG, this doesn't necessarily mean that this increase is the result of the stimulus I'm showing them. To confirm this, I need a point of comparison, or an experimental control. I need to compare what's currently happening in someone's EEG to what happens when there's no stimuli at all, so that I know any responses are most likely a result of the stimuli. So for each new session, the platform measures a participant's baseline EEG for 1 minute, while they're sat with their eyes closed. Then, when the audio-visual experience begins, their current EEG data is compared to this baseline. Brain response is then expressed as an increase in PSD relative to the baseline. This means that my metric represents an actual neural response instead of passive brain activity. The metric is applied to all frequencies in the EEG signal, meaning for each frequency, a number is calculated to show whether there's an increase in PSD at this frequency, and if so, by how much. I call this set of numbers neural resonance scores. Like I mentioned before, I need to look at the fundamental and first harmonic frequencies to see if neural resonance is occurring. My real-time data display helps me to do this. It shows the current stimulus frequency, that's the vertical green lines you can see on these graphs, and the current neural resonance scores at each frequency in the EEG, which are all plotted in the top graph here. By observing how these change over time, I can see whether my experiential design is producing neural resonance, which looks something like this on the data display. But how am I actually producing neural resonance? Earlier we looked at how periodic stimuli are used to do this. That's a sensory stimulus with a specific frequency. In the video we saw earlier of the final design, you might remember there was a sort of whirring sound panning from left to right. This is a pure auditory sine wave, and I'm using it as a periodic stimulus to produce neural resonance. Instead of using flashing lights, which are more common in neuroscience and BCIs but cause fatigue, I've embedded this audio stimulus into a soundscape, making it much more pleasant and interesting to listen to, while still producing neural resonance. Using the audio-visual controls, I can change the frequency of the stimulus and track changes in the resonance scores to see which frequencies resonate the most with a person's brain. So, now I can measure and optimize for neural resonance in real time. But I also need to know whether a participant is experiencing aesthetic resonance. The metric for this needs to be responsive to the changes I'm making to the audio-visual experience. To develop this metric, I look to design literature. In this literature, emotions are often used to assess aesthetic experiences. These specific emotions are called aesthetic emotions. Researchers Schindler and Hosoya split aesthetic emotions into 3 categories: pleasing, epistemic, and prototypical. Pleasing emotions relate to sensory pleasure, such as relaxation, whilst epistemic emotions relate to meaning, such as inspiration, and prototypical emotions relate to a general aesthetic appraisal, such as beauty. These emotions are what we feel as a result of an aesthetic experience, as opposed to what's represented by it. So, for example, if a film makes us sad, that's an aesthetic emotion, but seeing someone looking sad in the film isn't. Aesthetic resonance can occur when all 3 emotion categories are evoked by an aesthetic experience. Now, aesthetic emotions are usually measured with tools like questionnaires and interviews that rely on someone's memory of an experience and happen after the fact. But this can't tell me whether changes I'm making to the experiential design are having an effect. So I needed to decide how to translate aesthetic emotions to a real-time metric. Pleasing and epistemic emotions generally happen on an event-related basis, so in response to changes in aesthetic properties, whereas prototypical emotions are more to do with an overall reflection on an experience. Because of this, I decided to use pleasing and epistemic emotions as the basis of my real-time metric of aesthetic resonance, using prototypical emotions to assess the experience as a whole retrospectively. Schindler and Hosoya also state that pleasing emotions are broadly about pleasantness, how much we like something, whereas epistemic emotions are about engagement, how much attention we pay to it. So we can use these as scales for the real-time metric. The grid shown here is a touchscreen interface I designed to allow participants to easily and simply indicate the strength of engagement and pleasantness they're currently feeling in response to an aesthetic experience. To optimize for aesthetic resonance, I'm trying to get responses in the top right quadrant of the grid, so maximum engagement and pleasantness at the same time. And this is what aesthetic resonance looks like on the real-time data display. The pleasantness and engagement scores from the grid are combined with my neural resonance scores from before, to give an overall picture of the participant's aesthetic experience. This allows me to adjust properties of the audio-visual components and try to optimize for both neural and aesthetic resonance in an iterative manner. And finally, to assess prototypical emotions, I used a specialized questionnaire, also developed by Schindler and Hosoya, that was filled out by participants after each session, where they rated various emotional statements on a scale of 1 to 5, whilst reflecting on the experience. I could then compare this information with my real-time aesthetic data to see if the experience was aesthetically resonant overall. So, how was I trying to evoke aesthetic resonance? Well, aesthetically resonant experiences need to not only be pleasing and engaging, but beautiful too. I focused on making the soundscape and visualization changeable and unique to each participant. The soundscape is algorithmically generated, picking random chords from a musical key that the designer sets, and feeding notes from the chord to various synthesizers. By layering these with other audio effects, the soundscape becomes more textured and dynamic. The visualization, which you can see on my laptop screen here, is also algorithmically generated. The movement of the circles is controlled by Perlin noise. The color of these circles is set by the musical key of the soundscape, and they move more quickly or slowly as the frequency of the pure sine wave, my auditory periodic stimulus that I'm using to evoke neural resonance, increases or decreases. The visualization is then mapped to a matrix of LEDs, resulting in a softly glowing light source. Altogether, the sound and light are designed to evolve over time and respond to the participants' resonance data. And as I said before, I can adjust all of these properties in real time to optimize for the participants' aesthetic response. So now we know how the whole system works, what was I able to find out with it? Well, one of the main benefits of my platform is that all of the data it collects is labelled and synchronized. This means I was able to compare neural and aesthetic data easily, both for individuals and my participants generally. In doing so, my findings helped to answer the 3 research questions I set at the beginning of this project. Let's quickly recap them now. 1. Can neural and aesthetic resonance be evoked by the same sensory stimuli? 2. Does peak neural resonance correspond with peak aesthetic resonance? And 3. How can both forms of resonance be embodied in an experiential design? Well, to answer the first question, yes, it is possible to evoke both forms of resonance with the same sensory stimuli. By embedding a periodic stimulus, the auditory sine wave I described earlier, in a more complex and changeable soundscape, and expressing its musical properties through the visualization, I was able to optimize for each participant's aesthetic scores, producing aesthetic resonance. Although these scores naturally changed over time in response to the changing audio-visual experience, the average score for both pleasantness and engagement was positive for all participants. Additionally, the questionnaire results showed that both pleasing, epistemic, and prototypical emotions were all strongly and consistently felt by the participants, showing that the experience was aesthetically resonant. Likewise, using my auditory stimulus, I was able to optimize for neural resonance for the majority of participants. Again, the neural resonance scores naturally fluctuated throughout the experience, but summative data for each participant shows clear resonant responses at 1 or 2 stimulus frequencies, including both the fundamental and first harmonic. For example, this graph shows how one participant is showing neural resonance in response to an 11 Hz stimulus at the same frequency, so the fundamental frequency, and at double this frequency, 22 Hz, so the first harmonic. My second research question asked whether peak neural and aesthetic resonance correspond with each other. This question is a little more difficult to answer, as my data suggests that the relationship between the two isn't clear-cut. For example, most participants didn't show a clear aesthetic preference for the audio frequencies that maximize their neural resonance. However, some of the participants' data shows clear alignment over time between peaks in neural and aesthetic resonance, as shown in this graph. This is really interesting data, as even though it's not possible to say for sure if neural and aesthetic resonance influence each other, the data shows that I was able to optimize for both simultaneously using the same combination of audio and visual properties. And finally, my third research question asked how neural and aesthetic resonance could both be embodied in an experiential design. I found throughout the design process that there was a tension between needing to have an accurate, consistent neural stimulus and an aesthetically pleasing experience. By using audio, I was able to manipulate the aesthetic character of the stimulus in a much more nuanced and aesthetically pleasing way. And by making the visualization secondary to and dependent on the soundscape, participants maintained a sufficient level of attention to the neural stimulus to produce neural resonance. The synchronization between the sound and visual elements also helped to strengthen the aesthetic character of the experience, whilst the evolution of both sound and visuals over time made it more aesthetically engaging and opened up the design space for me to explore new combinations of properties. So, I was able to answer my research questions, but what do my findings mean for the field of design? Well, firstly, my metric of aesthetic resonance shows that it's possible to measure, iterate upon, and optimize aesthetic experiences in real time. In my user testing, these experiences were not only perceived as aesthetically resonant during the experience, but remembered as such afterwards too. Although the metric is simplified by necessity, it indicates that real-time aesthetic measurement is both useful for designers and a sufficient representation of aesthetic experience to be reliable. This also suggests that measurement tools like this merit further research, especially when they are currently much less common in design literature. My final design also demonstrates how real-time data and metrics can be generative for design. The metrics I've developed facilitate a feedback loop between a designer and participant or user, which enables designers to rapidly iterate on designed experiences. Additionally, they can quickly gather synchronized data that helps to make generalizable conclusions about the influence of different design factors on subjective experience. As more data is gathered, there are more opportunities to explore the fundamental relationship between our physical and psychological responses to design. Although the current version of the platform focuses on EEG or brain data, other forms of biodata could be incorporated with similar metrics. This could be of great benefit in design for well-being contexts, where designers need reliable measures to validate the positive outcomes produced by their designs. In future, the platform could be used, for example, to address the problem of sensory overload in healthcare staff, or the development of meditation technologies. And returning to the applications I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, my design has shown that it's possible to improve the experience of technologies based on neural resonance, such as brain-computer interfaces, without compromising effectiveness. Finally, the platform I've developed addresses an optimization problem between neural and aesthetic resonance. Optimization is often looked at in a computational context, where digital processing power can efficiently look for solutions. The labeled, synchronized datasets I've generated with my platform lend themselves to computational applications such as machine learning. Applying machine learning techniques to the data could help to further explore the relationship between neural and aesthetic resonance, looking for statistical significance that isn't visible to the human eye. It could also help to identify which audiovisual properties influence which resonance metrics and to what extent. This could lead to a variety of real-world applications, such as music recommendation engines that give suggestions based on what is most likely to resonate neurally and aesthetically with a user. Overall, this project has shown me the value of data and science in design, and how design can enrich scientific understanding of human experiences. I hope learning about my work has been as interesting for you as it's been for me. Thanks again for listening, and I'm looking forward to answering your questions very soon.